Okay, so welcome to Lecture 4 on Chapter 9. This chapter was about justice. So, something that I'd like to think about and raise at the beginning of this chapter, because justice is concerned about, the social good and what we owe other people and what other people owe us. That in the United States and in Western cultures in general, there's a real emphasis on individualism, um, and just focus on the self and self interest. And, even in the United States, we have people that are proclaimed as being self made. And um, um, it's interesting because at the same time that we have these values of extreme individualism, we have unprecedented interdependency. We're actually more dependent on other people than ever before, really in human history. So if you just look around the room that you're in right now, think about all of the different commodities around you: the computer you're using, any writing utensil you're using, your phone. If you have a beverage, where did the bottle for the beverage be made? Where was the beverage itself made? Think about all of the intense collaboration of labor that went into physically making all of the things around you, including the building that you're in, um, the clothing that you're wearing, the toothpaste you use when you brush your teeth. Like all day long, we are wearing clothes we didn't make, in buildings we didn't build, eating food we didn't grow, and interacting with objects all day long, that required unprecedented collaboration of labor and interdependency. So anytime anybody's like overly emphasizing how individualistic they are and independent they are, I think it's like from a big picture perspective interesting that we have those types of values and those types of emphases in our culture when like materially and physically like the amount of dependence is really unprecedented. And I think it's important to remember that, we are social animals. It's extremely disturbing and barbaric that in our criminal justice system, people are put in solitary confinement for not just days, weeks, months, but some people spend years in solitary confinement. And I really personally can't imagine like anything, more disturbing than being cut off from interacting from other people, considering we're such social creatures and our well-being and happiness is so contingent upon interacting with others. So anyways, we can continue along and define political and social philosophy as branches of philosophy that are concerned with justice. And political and social philosophy is the study of people and societies. So, some concepts that are important in political and social philosophy would be rights, duties, privileges. So, rights would be things that you believe all humans are guaranteed or entitled just by virtue of being human. Duties would be things that individuals owe others and owe society. Privileges would be things that are granted to individuals, um, given what they are able to contribute to society, or maybe given their status in society. It's political and social philosophy is also concerned with demands for justice, equality, and freedom. And it's important to make a distinction that by freedom here we mean political freedom. So this is freedom within a society or within a state to pursue one's interests and desires, versus metaphysical freedom, which would be like what we talked about in previous chapters, which is the question of, are we metaphysically, on a metaphysical level, do we actually have free will? So in social and political philosophy, it's not concerned with metaphysical freedom or whether we actually have free will or whether we're determined to what extent, but whether, we feel that we experience ourselves as free to pursue our own self-interest and our own desires. The textbook points out that politics are constrained and determined by our sense of morality. Politics is basically a morality on a macro scale, on a large scale. So, morality is concerned with relations between particular people, and politics is more concerned with large and impersonal groups. So, this is interesting because a lot of people say they hate politics or they're not political. And I think it's like understandable. That sentiment is understandable given how emotionally charged, intense, and full of conflict political conversations or encounters can be. But I think it's important to still be engaged politically and invested in politics, because to say you're not political or not interested in politics means is kind of basically like saying like you don't care about the well-being of other people, you don't care about the well-being of your society, you don't care about morality or ethics on a large scale, which can be pretty problematic. I mean, politics impacts every dimension of our lives, and basically everything we do is political because we all inhabit bodies that are gendered in some way, that are perceived as belonging to a particular race, that are perceived based on how we carry ourselves and dress and interact with others. All of that is coded as, as economic or class differences. So inescapably, everything we do is like politically imbued. Whoops. Some other definitions to note is the definition of the state. So the state is the authority that has the power to bring people in line with the public interest. It's the state that's typically thought to protect justice more broadly. And it's contested how much emphasis should be placed on individual rights and interests and the public interest. So typically, in the United States, people that lean more left and more coded as liberal tend to more emphasize how the state should be used more proactively in order to guarantee like the public interest. Whereas people on the right tend to believe in small government and small state power. But there's a lot of contradictions to that, because that's not necessarily true, because people that are socially conservative often are anti-choice, for example, and believe that the state should be involved in determining whether women or pregnant individuals have access to abortion, for example. Social conservatives also thought the state should be invested in preventing same-sex couples from being married and being able to adopt children. And people on the left often have more socially permissive ideas about freedom and individual interests and rights. But where it's a messy situation. But in general, people on the left in the United States tend to believe that the state believe that in the state having more control or emphasis in protecting the public interest. So specifically believing in big government in the form of, providing a safety net in the form of welfare programs for those that are poor or are disabled or people with disabilities. Where people on the right tend to believe that the government should not play a big role economically in guaranteeing the public interest. And sort of the extremes of this would be authoritarians who believe that the state should basically control every aspect of our lives in order to completely guarantee the public interest, and that individual freedom should be completely sacrificed to the public interest. And then on the other side, you have anarchists who believe that there shouldn't even be a state, that individuals should be completely free to be as invested in the public interest as they would like to be. So the problem of justice, there are some different types of justice. So retributive justice is basically like a really old concept of justice, sort of like primordial concept of justice. Kind of, you can think of it as like getting even. So, like, retributive justice basically assumes almost that like justice is like a force that exists out there. And when someone does something wrong to another person or something unjust, it's like an imbalance in this force of justice. And so what needs to be done is that person that did something wrong needs to be punished in order to rebalance, this force of justice. So, retributive justice perspectives believe in punishment for the sake of punishment. That even if punishing someone doesn't prevent them from doing more harm, that it doesn't really have any positive consequences other than just making people feel good, that, an eye for an eye kind of a thing, that it just sort of rebalances the force of justice, that would be sort of a retributive justice perspective on punishment. Whereas from a utilitarian perspective, and we'll talk about this later, the only reason why you would ever punish someone is to prevent harm, because utilitarian means the greatest good for the greatest number of people, and to avoid pain and punishment as much as possible. So you'd only punish someone if, so you'd put someone in jail only if it would prevent them from committing future crimes, for example. You wouldn't punish someone just to punish someone just for the sake of making them suffer because other people have suffered. The idea that you should punish and cause suffering as in itself a response to the suffering someone else has caused would be a form of punishment that you would find from a retributive justice perspective. So going back to just the problem of justice, this is a big topic. So more broadly, concerns about justice and concerns about politics involve such massive questions as how should wealth and goods be distributed? And that question of how should wealth and goods be distributed is a question that's related to what's called distributive justice. How should wealth and goods be distributed is distributive justice. Distributive justice also entails how should privileges and power be distributed. So looking at voting rights, who has a voice in a given society, that would be a question of distributive justice. And distributive justice is concerned about status and social and economic classes as well. And that's something that a lot of people don't think about, is that the United States has like a class system. Everything that we do, everything we purchase, the way we look, the way we talk, everything is coded as having some sort of economic class, social and economic class significance. If you're interested in thinking about this in a more concrete way, an amazing documentary on Canopy that I love to show in some of my classes is People Like Us. And it talks about like, even, do you like to buy, Wonder Bread or like, those cheap types of bread at the grocery store? Well, that's a really blue collar thing to do. Would you like to eat a baguette? That's a really like bougie thing to do. Just like everything you do and say, the music you like, everything is coded as having social and economic class significance. And I think that documentary People Like Us really speaks to that. But the way that it's coded in that way has to do with like the type of power that you have in society as well. And it's something that's interesting to think about. So the social contract is the single most influential conception of justice in modern times. And basically, it's an agreement among people to share in certain interests and make certain compromises for the good of them all. It's the consent of the governed theory. So basically, the social contract is, I'm not going to walk around and punch people in the face because I don't want to be punched in the face. And I have a vague understanding that I want to live in a society where people aren't just randomly punching each other in the face. So therefore, I sort of consent to the society's rules because of my own, the way it entangles my own self-interest in that we as a society are not gonna go around just randomly punching people in the face. So that'd be the social contract theory. It's kind of like the treat others the way you want to be treated, but like in a societal level. So that I control my behavior in so far as the way that I would like other people to control their behavior when they interact with me. So the social contract is not an actual verbal or written document. You accept the terms just by simply living in a society. One philosopher that was mentioned in the textbook is Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes is a really pessimistic philosopher. He's most famous for his work Leviathan. And Leviathan's like a monster. And he's basically saying like human nature is very monstrous and disturbing and base. And in Leviathan, he begins with the concept of the state of nature. Like, what are humans like in a natural state and not within like some sort of artificial civilization? And he says that basically in a state of nature, humans are pretty equal, that natural differences are not considerable. And some people don't buy into that. So that's just interesting to note. And he argues that from this general equality proceeds diffidence. And diffidence is like modesty or shyness resulting from like a lack of self-confidence. So we're all kind of insecure and shy because we reluctantly have to interact with each other and depend on each other. And from diffidence proceeds war, because diffidence results in a sort of resentment that leads to conflict. And he says for the three primary causes of quarrel or fighting are competition, which you engage in for gain, diffidence, which leads to concerns over safety and conflicts and quarrels related to safety, and glory, which is based on like our bizarre concerns for our reputation. And again, Hobbes is very pessimistic about human nature. The social contract is simply a doctrine of protection between mutually brutish individuals. So he believes in the social contract, but has a very pessimistic understanding of human nature, where the social contract is sort of keeps us in line from our naturally brutish instincts, and it's really from a state of reluctance that we enter into the social contract. Hobbes this is just a side note, but he's so pessimistic that he even says that people that engage in charity only engage in charity because they sort of enjoy or relish the fact that they are the ones in the position to be able to bestow goods or services or something on less resourced individuals. So that's the only reason why people are charitable. So another philosopher that engages with the social contract theory is Rousseau. And he's more optimistic, so he's kind of like the opposite of Hobbes. He says that humans are naturally good, but are corrupted by society. And instead of happiness being the sort of goal, goodness is the goal. The goal for Rousseau, though, is not to return to a state of nature, but to conceptualize the state based on an understanding of human nature. And he says that to be free is to act for the good of society. Many people find Rousseau disturbing because there's a line in his work that suggests that some in a society may have to be forced to be free. And so some credit Rousseau as being a forerunner of totalitarian and fascist governments. Pretty much like all of the major philosophers that we're talking about have been used on different sides of the political spectrum for opposing ideas and movements. And Rousseau is an example of that, where some find Rousseau very progressive because of his ideas about education and how we're naturally good and how it's really society that shapes us, rather than thinking that we have a lot of innate baggage. So that's just something that's important to note. So the Declaration of Independence was informed by some of these European Enlightenment philosophers and their ideas about the nature of, or about human nature, and how to conceptualize the state in light of that. So you have Thomas Jefferson writing the Declaration of Independence, which begins, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So Jefferson was influenced by Rousseau and was possibly aware of Hobbes, I'm not sure off the top of my head, and John Locke was another figure. Um, and the founding fathers and Thomas Jefferson were informed by a political school of thought called liberalism. So it's confusing because currently in the United States, we say people on the left tend to be liberal and people on the right are conservative. So with the liberalism that I'm talking about here in this context refers to the political philosophy of both liberals on the left and most conservatives. Left of liberals, there are leftists who have other ideas about the state and individual freedom and rights. And right of conservatives are people that are like, that would be considered fascist and would not be part of the school of liberalism. But liberalism just means a school of philosophy that promotes individual rights, civil liberties, democracy, and free enterprise. So it's kind of confusing that liberalism is a broader school that includes most like center left liberals and center right conservatives in the United States. What's to make things more complicated, a major political school of thought that has dominated the globe since the 1980s and really came to the forefront with Ronald Reagan in the 1980s is neoliberalism. And neoliberalism really emphasizes free market and privatization and as like a vehicle for individual rights, and it's like anti-welfare state. So neoliberalism is really associated with more fiscally conservative ideas in the United States. In the United States, because of the way that the United States has hegemony or power over much of the world and has a more pronounced role in global organizations like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the UN, the US has sort of imposed neoliberal ideas on the rest of the world. And what's interesting is the rest of the developed world finds neoliberal ideas to be very far right, when in the United States you can be center left and very neoliberal, like Barack Obama is a neoliberal, Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton are all neoliberals. And what's kind of interesting to consider is how in the United States, the political spectrum compared to the rest of the developed world is very much skewed to the right. So somebody that's center left in the United States would be like center right in the EU or in Europe, for example. So that's just important to consider. So Thomas Jefferson's part of the school of liberalism that a lot of the philosophers that you read about in this chapter in the West participated in and sort of formed. And I think it's important to know with Thomas Jefferson and all of the founding fathers of the United States, that like even in this like quote here, like all men are created equal, like they meant just men. I know some people say men or mankind when they mean both men and women, but here it really did just mean men. And it's also important to note that Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, and he not only like owned slaves, he sexually assaulted his female slaves, and then the children that he had with his female slaves, he enslaved. So he enslaved his own children as well. And so it's sort of important to note, like, that's something that we need to acknowledge with our founding fathers. Justice or care, a feminist perspective. So Carol Gilligan in the 20th century challenges the ethics of justice that's sort of been founded in Western philosophy for excluding some dimensions of moral experience, such as decision making, special obligations, the moral motives of compassion and sympathy, and the relevance of considering one's own integrity in making moral decisions. She also challenges the presumed gender neutrality of moral theory. So she pointed out how women, and she doesn't really have a stake in whether this gender difference for her is because of innate biology or because of the different ways men and women are socialized and the different social expectations that they have. But she noted that women tend to be more contextual in their moral reasoning, that they are more invested in the particulars of a situation, where men are more about abstract principles and rules, and that the context isn't really primary in their decision making. And she also said a lot of moral philosophers and political philosophers in Western thought sort of assume that human beings are naturally selfish and conceptualize morality and justice in terms of helping an individual overcome their selfishness and be more self-sacrificing. Where she said for women, and again, not clear whether she's saying this is biology or socialization, women tend to be too self-sacrificing and not put themselves enough, not take care of themselves enough, and be too selfless. So she said like that some of these like really broad general assumptions in moral and political philosophy in the West reflect a male bias, basically. So some questions. What is social and political philosophy? What is the relationship between politics and morality? And how did the textbook define the state? What are some concerns associated with the concept of justice? What is retributive justice? And how does a utilitarian conceptualize punishment? How might traditional ethical theories and ways of moral reasoning involve a male bias, according to feminist philosophers, and explain the approach of Carol Gilligan's feminist care ethics? So we just have a few more slides left. Individual rights and freedom. So one concept is unalienable rights, which we hear referenced in the founding documents, and these would be rights that no one and no government can take away. So the founding fathers allude to these rights being endowed within us by our Creator. What's interesting to note is that most of the founding fathers, including Thomas Jefferson, were not Christian, explicitly not Christian. They were deist, D-E-I-S-T, meaning they believed there was a Creator that created the world and our reality, but that Creator was laissez-faire or hands-off and does not interact with reality in any way, including absolutely not becoming incarnate in Jesus. Thomas Jefferson actually took the gospel accounts of the New Testament and took out all of Jesus's claims to divinity, all supernatural claims, and all miracles, and published the moral teachings of Jesus, because Thomas Jefferson and most of the founding fathers who were deist just saw Jesus as a moral philosopher. But they did believe that the Creator, this sort of abstract deity that doesn't interact with reality, did endow us with our rights and gives us like a sense of authority. It's interesting, for example, to think about like what are examples of unalienable rights. And of course, originally in our founding documents, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was actually life, liberty, and the right to own private property. So you can really see how the school of liberalism was developed in the West with the rise of capitalism. And so that's why part of liberal thinking, like liberal in a broader sense, is free enterprise, and is the sort of a right to accumulate private property and wealth. And just in a question that's interesting to think about in the context of liberalism is, when is it necessary or permissible to limit free speech? And a lot of early Western political philosophers that write about democracy talk about how within a democracy there has to be a really high threshold and tolerance for really horrible speech, as a just sort of an essential part of being able to maintain a democracy. John Stuart Mill is an ethicist that we've talked about, but he was also a political philosopher who was integral in the development of Western liberalism. And he wrote On Liberty. And in On Liberty, he defends the idea that minorities need to be defended against the tyranny of the majority in democratic societies. So in a democratic society, minorities are vulnerable to being overwhelmed by what he calls the tyranny of the majority. And so, for example, like the ending of segregation in the United States was not like a majority decision. That a lot of the development of human rights and expansion of civil liberties in the United States at the time of the expansion of civil liberties and rights and freedoms, the expansion wasn't representative of the will of the majority in the country. So that's an important thing to know, that there are possible limitations to democracy, including Mill's tyranny of the majority. Individual liberty for Mill is to be considered inviolable except when other people are threatened with harm. He says that we receive certain rights in return for certain obligations. So we are given the right to free speech, but only if we fulfill our obligation of being well informed and logically consistent. Mill makes a distinction between negative freedom, which is freedom from things, freedom from harm, freedom from so forth, so on and so forth, and positive freedom, which is freedom to perform obligations. So examples of positive freedom would be education. Like, is a freedom to be educated and literate like a guarantee? Should that be that'd be a positive freedom? And of course, in our country right now, we're debating whether healthcare should be a right or a commodity. And the question of making healthcare a right would be a positive freedom. Malcolm X is an important figure in the civil rights movement in the 20th century. And he makes a distinction between civil rights, which are rights guaranteed to an individual in a particular nation or state, and human rights, which are like sort of a universal, more expansive concept that shouldn't be contingent upon whether a state or a particular nation acknowledges them. So he makes the statement that if we have our human rights, our civil rights are automatic. Amartya Sen defends the idea, he's from India, defends the idea that hunger deserves much more attention than it has been getting from economists and philosophers. That all too often the rights of property are defended even when the consequence is that thousands of people starve. So he looked at a causal analysis of famine in terms of entitlements. He argued that we should increase entitlements, which would be like food stamps or welfare, for deprived groups, and guarantee a minimum of entitlements. He believes that there's a right not to be hungry. And it's true that I think globally there's enough food production to guarantee every person on the planet has, like, it's really high, like 2,800 or 3,000 calories a day. Yet, the bottom billion within the world regularly goes hungry and doesn't have access to enough food. So he asks the question, and a question is posed, that should there be limits to the accumulation of wealth? That, again, like there's enough resources for everyone to live a pretty comfortable lifestyle, but there aren't enough jobs or opportunities for individuals to prove their worth, that they should be given access to resources and privileges. And one of the reasons that this might be is because of the massive concentration of wealth at the top. That there are statistics on this, but the top billionaires have more wealth than the bottom billions of the world. In the United States, it's like the top 10 or something billionaires in the country have as much wealth as the bottom half of the country in the United States. So the sort of hoarding of wealth and power and resources at the top might be, it sort of takes wealth and resources out of the hands of millions, if not billions, of people. So Amartya Sen is very concerned with distributive justice. Basically, this is an example of distributive justice. Like, should there be billionaires? What is the point of that sort of accumulation of wealth and hoarding? I know a lot of billionaires are charitable, but not, anywhere near what the amount of resources and that would be distributed among, millions, if not billions of people if they did not have, the sort of accumulation of wealth that they had. Civil disobedience. So this is a concept that comes from Thoreau's, who's an American writer, Resistance to Civil Government. And so Thoreau is really obsessed with rugged individualism, and this sort of gendered, like rugged individualism. Like you picture like a lumberjack, and self-reliance. He defends his decision not to pay his taxes. And basically says that an individual has a right to disobey unjust laws. He believes that government is best which governs least. So like small government guy. So kind of like fiscally conservative in the United States. So an example would be like you could use his ideas to argue that there should be as much privatization as possible. That instead of the government controlling so many agencies and things, there should be privatization. And because of the rise of neoliberalism since the 80s, there's been a lot of privatization in the United States and globally. For example, the privatization of prisons. There are private prisons, private for-profit prisons. And there's a very pronounced and explicit paper trail between people that profit off of imprisoning citizens in the United States and those same people making political contributions and writing legislation to be pushed by various politicians that would ensure a steady supply of civilians to be imprisoned that they can make a profit off of. An example of privatization that might mean, some people for privatization make arguments that it makes things more efficient and cost effective. So for example, an example that I can think of that, where you might be able to see this would be the privatization of space travel. So Elon Musk has SpaceX and it's like a private space travel company, and it's finding all sorts of ways of making space travel more cost effective than when space travel was just done by NASA and was in sort of a public, federally funded endeavor. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. refers to Thoreau's civil disobedience, and you can see that in the letter from Birmingham jail. And his MLK's investment in justice is also coincides with his understanding of Christianity. And he emphasizes nonviolence, that you need to collect the facts to determine whether injustice exists. Then you try to negotiate with the oppressor or those that are causing injustice. You self-purify and make sure that you're not coming from a place of hypocrisy. And then you proceed with direct nonviolent action. He says, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. And of course, he's also famous for saying, justice too long delayed is justice denied. So some final questions. Explain the difference between negative freedom and positive freedom. What is the distinction between civil rights and human rights? What is civil disobedience? What are the 4 steps of nonviolent civil disobedience laid out by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from Birmingham jail? Are pacifists just, and these are sort of these last two are sort of discussion questions. Are pacifists or people that refuse to engage in war or be involved in any form of war justified in not paying their federal income taxes because they believe war and by extension military expenditures to be immoral? Is disobedience by violent means ever justified? And how might one draw a moral distinction between the father of the American Revolution and fathers of, I should say, fathers of the American Revolution and political terrorist groups? Okay.